Hello everyone and welcome to episode 15 of Runetalker. I'm Maitland, joined as always by Simon.
Hi everyone.
And we've got an exciting episode this week. It's time for our Twisted Fate and Aphelios deck guide episode. So very excited for this one because this is a deck we both love playing and we've got a lot to say about it, so it should be really good. We're going to discuss briefly about the balance patch, or the lack of balance patch that happened this week. Then we'll get stuck into the guide, going over the concept of the deck, flex slots, mulligans, play patterns, good matchups, bad matchups, and just really everything TF and Aphelios. How excited are you for discussing your favourite two champs, potentially, Simon?
Yeah, I'm pumped. So this is a great deck. I've been playing it a lot this season and managed to peak top 20 masters with it. I have a foil Aphelios and a foil Twisted Fate, so that just shows how serious I am about this deck.
Yeah, you can really see when your opponent plays the foil champions. What's your mastery at for Twisted Fate and Aphelios? How are you looking in that region?
Maybe 2, maybe 3. Not too sure. Could use some work.
Yeah, it sounds like you're more of a pay to win than an actual master, but that's fine.
Right.
That's fine. So yeah, let's get going. This episode is coming up a couple of days late. Apologies, we had some technical difficulties in recording the ep, and so we're having to try again. But hopefully, it'll be the last ep was fantastic. Just take our word for it that you'll never hear it, but it was brilliant. And hopefully, this ep lives up to the lofty standard that we set.
Yeah, I'm really hoping we can hit those highs again.
It's really awkward. I've had this happen before where an app's not worked, and trying to have the same conversations again is really tough. But we'll do our best. So, as we mentioned, there was I keep calling it a balance patch. It wasn't really a balance patch. It was just a patch that happened this week. It was a bug fix. They fixed a lot of bugs, which I'm very excited about because some of those bugs were quite annoying. And everyone was expecting, I think, that for there to be nerfs to particularly TF Fizz, which has really become the boogeyman of this format, and there was not. And so, how have you felt in the aftermath of the lack of balance updates in this patch, Simon?
Honestly, I'm a little disappointed that they didn't tune anything in the deck. I think it sort of had its time in the sun. It definitely needs to be touched. It arguably has needed, nerfs for months. Even before stress testing came out, it started really sort of dominating. And after that, it's been really good. And it's also picked up some more good matchups in the form of some of the Aphelios decks, which have popped up. So it was a little disappointed to not see a nerf. But at the same time, I didn't realize that apparently, according to the right balancing schedule, this patch was never supposed to have nerfs. So it's one of those things where maybe we just need to sort of get used to the fact that not every patch is necessarily going to have balance fixes in it. But it is a little bit disappointing considering I feel like Riot have generally been pretty good at getting on top of this kind of thing. The only real instance where I think they've let something go on for way too long was the Twisted Fate Go Hard list, which, didn't really get nerfed for a couple of months, but at the same time, that was over the holiday breaks, so I think that's pretty understandable. How have you felt about it, Maitland?
Yeah, and I mean, I get the rules or whatever guidelines they have around when they do balances is what it is. I do think that if you're going to have a set release where you don't do any balance updates, and then I feel like the patch 2 weeks after that should probably at least have the option. I don't really know about these like locking yourself into these the only times we're allowed to do balance updates. In a digital card game, I don't really feel that you need to put that constraint on yourself, particularly when, like you said, like TF Fizz, it needed a nerf with the set release, and 2 weeks later it needs a nerf. And however your schedule's set up, I think it's probably pretty important to at least give yourself the option, if you're not going to do the nerfs during a set release, which is fair enough, to at some point afterwards make sure that you can adjust to the format. Because I do think that I think that compared to sort of like other card games, I've played a lot of card games, played in a lot of metas. I don't think this meta is like close to the worst I've played or anything, but Runeterra has set a really high standard for itself. With keeping the meta fresh, keeping players interested, addressing decks that get out of hand. And I just because of that lofty standard, I think that it really surprised me that there were no changes at all, and not just nerfs, because I think it's also, I really like to see tweaks to cards to give them a little buff and bring some fresh new players into the meta where they weren't popular previously.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And like you said, it's not that they're necessarily doing a bad job. It's just, they were doing such a good job before that it's a little bit disappointing to see them sort of slide in the other direction. But who knows, there could be some technical issues on the back end, which means, when they actually, launch a patch or lock a patch in, they don't really have that much flexibility or that many options. So who really knows?
Yeah, I'm certainly not taking to Twitter to tweet at Ruben how he's destroying the game or anything. Because obviously, like, we don't know what's happening behind the scenes, what constraints, what problems they have. But I was expecting nerfs. I would have liked them, and I haven't played as much in the last week as I would have if there had been nerfs. I'm a bit concerned about if I'm going to get to Masters before the seasonal, but there's still some time at least, so we'll see how we go. All right, that's pretty much everything we wanted to talk about outside of Twisted Fate Aphelios, so let's get stuck right in. Why don't you you did a fantastic spiel of the concept of the deck last time. Why don't you try and hit that note for note?
Yeah, so basically, when we're looking at TF Aphelios, if you haven't played the deck before, the goal of the deck is really to bury your opponent with incremental advantages. You have 3 key threats in basically every matchup, which can completely carry games for you. So that's Twisted Fate, Aphelios, and Veiled Temple. You can have some ridiculous opening hands. A Duskbringer into Aphelios on turn 3 allows you to play Aphelios' Moon Weapon Crescendum, which pulls a 2-drop out of your deck. The only 2-drop in your deck is boxtopus. Boxtopus is a 3/4 challenger, which has, when you play me, deal 3 damage to me, but because Crescendum lets you summon a unit from your deck, boxtopus comes down as a 3/4. So you can end up with these ridiculously fast starts where you end up with 8 power in play on turn 3. Or the other way that you can win games is just by going out of control with big Celestials, with Star Shaping, or by beating down with, Burblefish in the late game. So you have a diverse range of threats, and you want to protect your threats, generate value, and you also get a lot of flexibility to counteract what your opponent's doing as well.
Yeah, in addition to the big celestial threats that you can get, Veiled Temple can even make your innocuous little Lunari Duskbringers into... I've had some very big Duskbringers that end up winning the game. That's, as you said, Temple's just another huge win condition, as well as flipping TF the old-fashioned way and getting in there is always going to close out games quite quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to imagine that flipping TF the old-fashioned way is, waiting 7 turns. Just let him natural flip.
As I said that, I didn't mean flipping TF the old-fashioned way. I meant that's winning games the old-fashioned way, because we've won our fair share of games with Twisted Fate now. So it's going to be a shame to have to retire. Well, hopefully you don't have to retire him. Hopefully he just gets a well-needed adjustment, because he's a bit strong. He's a bit strong. All right, why don't we run through our current deck list? And sort of card by card. We can talk about each card, and then after that we'll sort of go through the flex slots. So do you want to talk about the big, probably secretly like one of the most powerful cards in the deck, Lunari Duskbringer?
Yeah, absolutely. And for anybody who wants to load this deck up and take a look as we go through it, we have the code in the show notes. So let's talk about Lunari Duskbringer. So it's a 2/1. When it's summoned, it creates a Dusk Petal Dust in hand. Dusk Petal Dust is a burst spell, and it costs 1 mana, and it says the next unit with Nightfall you play this round costs 1 less. So essentially, it gives you a free Nightfall activator, which can be really powerful with Aphelios. So we mentioned the nut draw start of you play a Duskbringer on 1, pass on turn 2, then on turn 3, you get to play the Dusk Petal Dust into Aphelios, and you generate a Crescendum, which can then give you a 3/4 Challenger Boxtopus. Next up in the deck, we've got Spacey Sketcher, so we have 2 copies of the card. So this card, you get to discard a card to invoke a Celestial card that costs 3 or less. The big combo in this deck is, in the early game, you're digging for Moon Silver and the Serpent, which are both 0 mana cards that allow you to also get that turn 3 Aphelios plus Moon Weapon off. You don't necessarily want as many copies of Spacey Sketcher in your deck because you can sort of flood on that effect, and you don't really generate cards that you can pitch to the Spacey Sketcher. So that's why we're only running 2. Next up, we've got Boxtopus, so we have 3 copies. It's a really strong unit. It's the best 2-drop in the game to pull with Crescendum, and that's really why we're running it in the deck. You really want to pay attention to how many copies of Boxtopus are left in your deck as you play the game, because that's really going to help inform which weapons you might want to get off Aphelios. Next up, we've got Gifts from Beyond as a one-of. So this is an interesting sort of flex piece. It allows you to create a Moon Weapon in hand for 2 mana. So it's a little bit overcosted for the effect, but the flexibility can be really strong in a lot of places. We'll talk about it a bit more when we talk about some of the flex slots in the deck. Next up, we've got 3 Guiding Touch, 3 Pale Cascade. They just help you to draw more cards, get to your key threats, sometimes flip Twisted Fate. We have 2 copies of Sunblessed Vigor. This allows you to protect your champions. 3 Aphelios, 2 copies of Hush, 3 copies of Pick a Card, which is another card we'll really dig into when we talk about flex slots. This is just a good way to help flip Twisted Fate and to cycle to key cards in your deck. 1 copy of Bastion, 3 copies of the Veiled Temple, 3 copies of Twisted Fate, 1 Zap Spray Fin, 1 Moonlit Affliction, 3 copies of Star Shaping, and 3 copies of Wiggly Burblefish.
Yeah, so pretty happy with the list where it is now. Yeah, and let's sort of go through and drill down what makes some of these cards tick and some of the flex slots. So Spacey Sketcher is a really interesting one, and I think you sort of touched on that, and I think it's sort of it's an interesting thought exercise that I do a lot in card games that's really relevant for when you end up in these situations where you have a limit on how much of a card you can have in your deck, but there are sort of replacement effects which are similar but not as powerful. And what I always think about is how many of, if I had no limit to how many of the card I could run, what would I want to put in my deck as the sort of optimum amount to sort of help me think about how many of the extra replacement effects I want to include. And so for this example, Lunari Duskbringer is one of the strongest cards in giving you that nut draw into turn 3 Aphelios Boxtopus. But, I mean, you wouldn't run 40 Lunari Duskbringer. Your deck would be terrible. And, well, you'd probably beat a lot of the decks I run, but and so how many Lunari Duskbringer, if there was no limit, would I want to be running? And that's what I think about when I'm thinking about how many copies of Spacey Sketcher I want to include, because as Simon says, the reason Spacey Sketcher is really in here is to also give you that nut draw into Aphelios, and also the discard's useful sometimes. It helps you get rid of the dust petals that Duskbringer makes, which you don't really have any use for. After, if you don't do turn 3 Aphelios, then they just sort of sit in your hand for the rest of the game. You can pitch them to pick a card, but Sketcher is one of the best uses you really have for them. And so, where do you think? Do you think that 5 is the amount of Duskbringers you'd want to run, Simon, if there was no limit?
Honestly, I think if there was no limit on Duskbringer, I still might play a 3-2 split, just because I do think Spacey Sketcher can be very important in some matchups, even where, Duskbringer isn't. So, for instance, some of those 3-cost or less Celestial cards can sort of win you the game on the spot. So, being able to find the Serpent to kill your opponent's Twisted Fate, or being able to find an Equinox to kill their, to shrink their massive crowd favorite, or a Crescent Strike to stun their copy of the Watcher. I think Spacey Sketcher gives you a lot of options later on in the game, while still in the early game enabling the Aphelios start. But at the same time, on turn 1, I almost always want to play Lunari Duskbringer to preserve that Spacey Sketcher option in the future. So it's definitely an interesting combination, and you can play with the numbers a little bit.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It is the 3-cost or Celestial card is a very interesting pool, and there are. Yeah, getting the Serpent can just be so powerful if you get to get a Twisted Fate with it, or an Aphelios, and getting Spell Shield off the Moonglow is one of my favourite ones to do as well. If your opponent taps out on a specific turn, thinking that, they've got time to deal with Aphelios or Twisted Fate. They can afford to develop their board this turn, and then use Spacey Sketcher, give your unit Spell Shield, and then suddenly the window that they have to interact with those threats before they flip and take over the game has dramatically decreased.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of what makes the card powerful, because at the same time, you do have to discard a card to get any value off the Sketcher. So, you have to make up for that card disadvantage. You've spent the Sketcher, which is a card, and then whatever you've discarded for a 1/1 body plus the Celestial card. So it is kind of a risk. And sometimes, if you don't hit the right Celestial card, it really sucks. But definitely, I think, a powerful piece, and that's why it's included in these lists.
Yeah, absolutely. So boxtopus, not really too much more to say about boxtopus. It is worth noting that there's a number of ways to heal boxtopus in this deck, with Guiding Touch and Star Shaping, as well as Aphelios moon weapons. And so if you have to play one from hand, I quite often, instead of playing boxtopus on turn 2, I'll wait until turn 3 so that I've got the Guiding Touch up to beat a Mystic Shot, or to be able to eat my opponent's 2-drop whilst keeping my boxtopus alive. So that's a play pattern that I see come up a lot, and I'm quite a big fan of. So that's just worth something to be aware of, is that, you're able to actually, it's not just a 3/1 when you play it, you are able to heal it up and protect it a bit. And boxtopus also is one I find useful sometimes against fearsome decks, being able to play a 2-drop that will block Miss Wraiths and other fearsome creatures can be really important in those matchups that pressure you very early on.
Yeah, definitely. Boxtopus is really one of the all-stars in this list, and I think it's one of the main reasons that people started pairing Aphelios with Twisted Fate to begin with. It was sort of like, wow, we really want to have access to Boxtopus, so what's the best either Bilgewater or Targon champion we can also run alongside this package? And one of the answers is Twisted Fate. The other front runner is Zoe, so I think that's why those two decks sort of exist in the meta right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Gifts from Beyond is a card that we're currently running a 1 of. We've tried 2 in the past. I don't know if you've ever run 3. That feels like it'd be
bit much.
Yeah, a bit much. But yeah, we've tried 0, 1, and 2. We're currently on 1. It's just, like you were saying, it's just a really flexible card, and it's never super efficient, but the options that it gives you are so important. There's a lot of matchups where you obviously haven't gotten your nut drawn to Aphelios, but you might, like Boxtopus as a 3/4 in turn 3 is still really powerful, and so Gifts lets you develop that unit to pressure your opponent's board. It can help you get the lifesteal or Severum in a lot of matchups where it's incredibly critical that you get one big hit in to gain a huge amount of life. Gravitum is really important with the Watcher out there trying to obliterate people's decks. And so I think having a gift just as that Swiss Army knife that's able to be so useful in so many different situations, as well as flipping your Aphelios slightly faster. And I just think that it definitely pulls its weight in this list, and it's never a card that I'm too disappointed to draw.
Yeah, exactly right. It's basically one of those cards that's sort of like glue that holds the rest of the deck together. It does a lot of things in a lot of instances. It never does it sort of above rate. You're never getting a great deal on mana. But just the fact that it can answer, so many things that your opponent can do, or things that you might just really need to do in that instance. On turn 3, some games, you just really have to get a Boxtopus down to start to threaten some of their backline champions before they can snowball, or even just having another, 2-mana burst spell, which you can proactively use to trigger Nightfall on Aphelios can be very strong. So that's another common play pattern, is Gifts on turn 3, find a copy of Crescendum, play my Aphelios, make another Crescendum, turn 4, play 2 copies of Crescendum. That's like a perfectly fine way to start the game. And like you mentioned, I think 1 is the right spot to be. I could see playing 2, but I would never play 3. And the reason is, once you start getting multiples in your hand, it does start to weigh down the deck, and you already have some cards in the deck which, if you draw too many copies of them at the wrong time, you're just going to be in a really bad position, so you don't want to be adding to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if it drew a card for Twisted Fate, I think I'd really like 2 copies. But yeah, as it currently works and functions, and it's not even that. When you compare it to like Aftershock, you're still paying 4 mana to deal 3 to a creature with Cleaver, which is something you often do with it. So it's not even as necessarily a bad rate as it seems, and it's just I think a lot of people probably haven't tried this in their list. So I definitely give it a go, just because it doesn't look very impressive, but you'll find that when the times you're never disappointed to draw it, and it always you're able to get something out of it. So I think it's worth giving a go at least.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, next up is we've got Guiding Touch and Pale Cascade. I actually like Guiding Touch more than Pale Cascade, I think, in this list. And we've mentioned the interaction with boxtopus, but we're also running some Sunblessed Vigor. And with the Veiled Temple, as we sort of said before, you quite often get a unit that's quite large. And so Guiding Touch in these sort of decks is quite often just sort of heals face, or sometimes you're even on 20 and you just use it to draw a card, enable Nightfall, that sort of stuff. But in this deck, you're really able to leverage being able to heal units in ways that I think is really powerful. And so that's something I'm always looking to do. And you do end up in interesting situations where it's difficult to tell if it's correct to heal face or to heal your unit, which is really cool as well. But yeah, I quite often lean towards, unless you're against a very burn-heavy deck, healing your units just to keep that board presence and start to overwhelm your opponent. And Pale Cascade does a similar thing. It's obviously not as powerful since being nerfed, but there's still quite a few situations you end up in where your opponent tries to Mystic Shot one of your champions and Pale Cascade saves it, or just in combat you're able to trade up with it. And so it's very useful, whilst both of them are there also to help you flip Twisted Fate a bit quicker.
Yeah, definitely. Again, they're sort of like glue cards as well. They just make it so you can cycle through your deck, make it so you have these burst speed ways to trigger your temple or get extra Aphelios moon weapons, and I think they're really important to the deck. Like Maitland mentioned, being able to heal your units is really powerful with Guiding Touch. One thing which does come up with this list pretty frequently is if you end up with 1 or 2 copies of the Veiled Temple in play, suddenly board space can become quite an issue for you. So keep an eye out on that. If you do find that you have a lot of cheap units in play, which you could easily be, chump blocking with, or you can't really develop at the moment, I would lean towards using Guiding Touch on your face rather than your creatures. But, it definitely depends on the situation, and having access to that ability is really strong.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just, like you said, they're the glue that really holds the deck together. This is a deck that wants to be utilizing its spell mana, casting a lot of cards, drawing a lot of cards, and so having cards that are cheap, draw cards for Twisted Fate, and let you refill your hand so you're able to keep casting 2 cards a turn for Veiled Temple is just really strong and really important. And so, yeah, they're just fantastic cards that always overperform in the deck. So on to our next slot, which is more of a flex slot. We're currently running 2 Sunblessed Vigor. These I've been really impressed with as well. Just similar to what we were saying about Pale Cascade, just being able to beat removal, particularly things like Avalanche on your 2 health champions. And then once they've taken the 2 damage, where you're able to heal them up with Guiding Touch again and beat another removal spell. Sunblessed Vigor, the fact that it's permanent health is just so useful in protecting your really high value threats. And sometimes your opponent only has 1 spell window to interact with them before Veiled Temple takes them out of damage-based spell range. And so it's also doesn't cost much to keep up, and so it doesn't draw you cards, so it's not as good as Guiding Touch and Pale Cascade in that sense. It doesn't help you flip Twisted Fate, but your threats in this deck are so important that having really cheap ways to protect them I've found to be absolutely invaluable.
Yeah, I think it's super useful, and another neat interaction with it is Blighted Ravine deals damage at the start of the next turn, so a Pale Cascade wouldn't be able to save your champion from a Blighted Ravine, but Sunblessed Vigor can. So definitely keep that in mind as well, because it hurts when when you Pale Cascade your Aphelios thinking it's going to survive and it doesn't, and you're staring at a Sunblessed Vigor in hand as well.
Yeah, I've definitely had a number of opponents that have learned that lesson well. I can't imagine you make that mistake more than once. And so, no. I mean, it's a weird card, Blighted Ravine, and so I think we've all as a community gone on a learning curve with it. And yeah, sometimes figure being able to beat that is just really important with the Lysandra Trundle deck being as strong as it is.
Absolutely.
Right. Let's talk about Hush. So we're currently running 2 Hush and 1 Moonlit Affliction as our silence spells. How have you felt with... I guess it really depends on the meta, exactly how many... There's been decks that have run a lot less Hush in the past, and it feels to me at least like 3 is a really good spot to be in at the moment. Hush feels like it's really overperforming in this meta.
Yeah, definitely. I think 3 silence effects is the right place to be at the moment. I prefer 2 Hush, 1 Moonlit Affliction, just because I like having a little bit of diversity in those answers, particularly if you end up in a spot where you draw multiples in a game, which can sometimes happen. These games go quite long. So having access to something like Moonlit Affliction, even though it costs 2 extra mana, can be really good. And, every now and again you get the Nightfall ability that the 2 units that you silence can't block this round, and that can win you games. Or, you might end up playing against Fiora Shen and they play a Stand United, giving 2 units barrier, and you get to silence them both. So you definitely have some real blowout potential. And I think that's worth the extra 2 mana that you pay for the Moonlit Affliction.
Yeah, I agree that sometimes getting the double blowout is just absolutely huge. And yeah, silence effects just feel really powerful at the moment. Fiora Shen is a really popular deck that silence effects are very strong against, and also there's a lot of Nasus decks flying around that silence is really able to embarrass, as well as it's always just funny to Hush a Fizz.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Hush 2 elusives, block them both. Moonlit Affliction definitely can protect you against some of those TF Fizz hands, which you might otherwise have a lot of trouble against, but will probably still lose to, because that deck is really good.
Yeah, it's a good one, and I guess part of the reason why it's so good is pick a card. And so pick a cards, it's an interesting one that some lists aren't running in Twisted Fate Aphelios. I personally wouldn't dream of not running it at the moment. I think it's just such a huge part of what makes Twisted Fate strong, is being able to flip it quickly, and without pick a card you really struggle to flip Twisted Fate, unless I guess you draw multiple copies and use pick a card, Twisted Fate's pick a card. But yeah, it's really important in helping you flip Twisted Fate, which gives you basically another threat instead of Twisted Fate just being a good value card. It's a game-winning threat. It helps to transition it there. And also just being able to draw 3 cards, get a heap more gas in the tank, particularly when you've got Temple out and you're able to do so many things in a turn, you're easily able to burn through those cards. So it just gives you a lot of action, like drawing Burblefish is quite often free, so you can get through that. You're able to use the 3 cards really easily, and so it's just really strong. It lets you shuffle boxtopus back into your deck for crescendums, which is really good, and helps you use the petals that you get off Duskbringer as well. It's just, it's just an exceptionally strong card, especially with the classic play of Twisted Fate on turn 4, pick a card into hopefully flipping Twisted Fate next turn.
Yeah, agreed. I think it just really takes Twisted Fate from, like you said, just this piece, which is a strong value piece that they'll eventually have to deal with, to a game-ending threat. And it just makes Twisted Fate worth protecting, whereas otherwise, you could just play a Twisted Fate, get a little bit of value off it, and not care that much if it dies. But honestly, I think at that point, if you're not committing to making Twisted Fate a game-winning threat, why are you running Twisted Fate in this deck? I think at that point, you should really consider, maybe I should just be playing Zoe Aphelios then, so I don't have to sink all those resources in. That's another card which can generate some value. The opponent, sort of eventually has to answer. It can snowball, run away with the game, but it's cheaper. So I honestly think pick a card is really, really strong in the deck, and I don't think I would play Twisted Fate Aphelios without it.
Yeah, and one of the plays that I do most often with pick a card is utilizing the fact that it's burst, and so opening my turn on turn 4 with pick a card and passing to my opponent to see, they might foolishly tap out of their removal for Twisted Fate, which lets me play Twisted Fate, blue card, and get an extra spell mana that I wouldn't have gotten if I played Twisted Fate first, and then pass a turn next turn with an extra mana and my 3 spells off pick a card.
Yeah, it's definitely a great line, and it can run away with games if your opponent doesn't really have an answer.
Yeah, all right. next one is another flex slot. This is definitely much more of a flex slot that, yeah, I can see, you know, it comes out of the deck. It's not necessarily imperative that you have a one of Bastion, but I do really like it. I think it gives you, on the ladder, just some huge blowout opportunities where your opponent, particularly, you know, getting a vengeance is just absolutely massive with it. And there's a lot of situations where you're able to leverage that card. It's not super cheap like a lot of your spells are, but it does give you an extra layer of protection in addition to the +1/+1. And so I also really think that it's quite good as a one-of for the seasonal or an open decklist tournament, because your opponent, knowing that you have one copy of Bastion, has to play their whole game totally differently, knowing that you could have that answer in your hand and respecting that whenever you have 4 mana up.
Yeah, I think it's a powerful effect, but it's also an effect that, you don't want too many copies of. It can get a bit clunky. Some plays to keep in mind with Bastion as well. If you're, super scared of your opponent having access to a freeze effect or to a hush effect, you can actually use Bastion on your unit before you attack. That means that they won't actually be able to break the spell shield unless they have 2 burst spells. So they would have to play a burst spell to break the spell shield and then play the hush effect.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. An interesting tweet I saw the other day, that I don't know if you've seen this interaction. It's not really related to this deck at all, but someone was playing with flipped Severe, and they're in a situation where their opponent had flipped Severe, was attacking him with a bunch of units that all had Spell Shield and Quick Attack, and they had some weird stack where they were single combating a creature and then trying to Judgment and kill it, basically. But the way that Severe works is that it's not worded that, like, it's worded that when Severe is attacking, all allies have its abilities. And so using a spell on your opponent's Spell Shield unit will get rid of it, but Severe says that it still has Spell Shield, so it doesn't actually go away. So its Spell Shield stops the spell, and then it's still got Spell Shield for the next spell, which I don't know if you've seen that interaction, but I thought that was pretty surprising.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. So you have to hit Sivir there, and then all units will lose Spell Shield. So that's the way around that.
Yeah, that's just one to be aware of with Spell Shield, the least intuitive mechanic that's ever existed in any game.
Yeah. We'll definitely get around to doing an episode on how much you hate Spell Shield.
Oh god, I need to understand Spell Shield enough before we get there, and I'm nowhere near yet. So the next card we're going to talk about is the Veiled Temple, which is just one of the strongest cards in the game at the moment, and this deck utilizes it to incredible levels. It's one of the few things that I'm looking for in my mulligan, and I'm looking to try and get it into play as soon as possible. It's always a big tempo hit when you play it, but it pays you back just so quickly that I'm always willing to get it down with how many cheap ways we have to activate it and how many things we have to do with our mana, how many high-value creatures we have to get down. One of the things I think that's most important to think about with Temple and you're sculpting your game plan is which unit is going to get buffed, and should I sequence my play slightly differently to ensure that a different unit gets buffed? For example, do I really need Burblefish to get buffed so that I've got that elusive threat to win? Do I really need Boxtopus to get buffed so that I can continue to control the board? Or do I want to buff Aphelios to get it out of damage-based removal range? And thinking about how you sequence your cards to get the desired effect is really important. And something I see come up a lot is that when you play Crescendum, the Veiled Temple will trigger before your Boxtopus comes into play. And so if you want to get the Boxtopus pumped, then you need to Crescendum as your first spell and then play something else to get that pumped. So that's just one to be aware of.
Yeah, so on that note as well, one interaction which has punished me a couple of times is, you might think to yourself, oh, I would really like to get, this unit to get the Veiled Temple trigger. So I'm going to play Pale Cascade on the unit to make it bigger so that Veiled Temple will put +1/+1 on it. But the issue with that is you generally don't cast a Pale Cascade as your first spell. And like Maitland's just said, when you play your second spell, the temple will trigger while that spell is on the stack. So what's going to happen is a unit will get +1/+1, then Pale Cascade will give your unit +1/+1. So just keep that in mind, that if you do want to use Pale Cascade to get the +1/+1 somewhere, you need to play it first and give up on the Nightfall draw one. So that line isn't going to come up often, but if you really need that to work, just keep that in mind.
Yeah, I've absolutely made that mistake, and very recently, and I don't think I really processed what had happened. It just feels like burst spells should be happening too fast.
Way too fast. Too fast for the temple, yeah.
Exactly. But the temple happens even faster, which is quite impressive. But yeah, temple is just such an important one, and the games where you've got temple play out just totally differently to ones where you don't. There's a lot of things you've got to be considering, such as making sure, or trying to make sure that you use unit mana before the proc goes off, because if you just play like a 1 mana spell and a 2 mana spell with spell mana, you're wasting the temple mana because it can only give you unit mana. So making sure that you cast a unit or use that mana first is really important to get the most value out of it. And with the temple, it really, like, getting the most value out of it is really important, because you are able to just really leverage this card, and you can get giant units if you're able to cast multiple spells every turn, and they're able to win you the game, especially with getting trample from Aphelios.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, let's move on. So Zap Sprayfin is an interesting one that I think older versions of this list were running 4 sort of as standard, but especially since Veiled Templars come out with the Temple and Twisted Fate, you just have a lot of really strong 4-drops already. And I found, particularly recently, that there's just never really any good opportunities to be casting Zap Sprayfin. And so I think 1's fine. It's still a really good unit, but I definitely don't want the full 3, and I wouldn't be against cutting the last 1 either. But it's strong. It draws you a card for Twisted Fate. It replaces itself. It gives you spell mana. It's an elusive threat. It does a lot of things, but it's just that you'd really rather have one of your champions or the temple in play, and then once you've got any of those, all you really want is really cheap things. It doesn't have as big an impact on the game as like Star Shaping, for example, and it's got a very similar cost. So Zap Sprayfin, fine, but I think it's a flex slot at this stage, and I think 1 or less is probably a reasonable place to be.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, a lot of the time you just have so much to do with your mana already. And given that the spells it's drawing to are often fine, but not incredible, I don't think Zap necessarily pulls its weight. Particularly given, as we mentioned earlier, in a lot of games you end up with 1 or 2 copies of the Veiled Temple in play, at which point the rest of your board space becomes a really, sought after resource. You can only have 4 units in play. Ideally, you want one of them to be a Twisted Fate, one of them to be an Aphelios. In most cases, you'll have a boxtopus as well. You might have a large celestial off a Star Shaping. And
this is such a good board.
I know. At that point, where's the space for Zap Sprayfin? Or, you might have... Your opponent might have some really big creatures in play, and let's say you have a Lunari Duskbringer, an Aphelios, a Spacey Sketcher, and a boxtopus. Would you like to get rid of one of those units to play a Zap Sprayfin? And the answer is almost always, going to be no. So I think that's also one of the reasons why Zap has sort of fallen off in this particular list.
Yeah, the big problem with Zap, like you said, is the situations where you have 2 temples, Aphelios, Twisted Fate, a huge Celestial, and a Boxtopus, and Zap Sprayfin just doesn't do anything in those situations, and so that's really...
Exactly. That's really holding it back.
That's the biggest knock against it.
If it wasn't for that, I think, Zap would see some more play, yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Star Shaping is another flex slot that we're currently on 3 of, and I really like 3. I think that the card is just so versatile and powerful that it's quite often the best thing you can draw. It's really good against aggressive decks where your life total is important. Gaining 5 is a massive chunk of life, and it's really good against the slow, grindy control decks in the late game. It's, again, your best draw, because being able to pull from the expensive Celestial pool will quite often give you a really good threat, and that will give you a really good way to close out the game, particularly with the Veiled Temple pumping it up even further. Star Shaping just sort of does it all. It's really good with Veiled Temple in that it lets you, use your like 3 spell mana and 2 unit mana so that you can activate the temple. And it's really good at setting up situations which you end up in a lot. And maybe we wouldn't want to talk about this in the play patterns with Veiled Temple, but where you want to utilize burst spells to give your opponent priority and then try and bait them into passing so that you're able to end the turn in an advantageous way. Star Shaping really just does it all.
Yeah, it just does so much. And like you touched on, the fact that it's good in multiple matchups, so the fact that it's one of your best cards against control in the late game, but also one of your best cards against a burn deck once you start to stabilize. I mean, yeah, it's definitely one of those cards where, against burn, you don't want to have an opener of 3 copies of Star Shaping, but once it's turn 5 or 6, you've stabilized the board, and the only real way they can beat you is with burn spells. It suddenly becomes the number 1 card I'm looking for. So the fact that it can be, that good across matchups is the reason why I want to run 3. It's also an exceptional card in the mirror match because some of the cards that you can hit off Star Shaping are just unbeatable. So Cosmic Inspiration is incredible in the mirror match, pumping all of your units. You can also end up with Living Legends, which gives you access to a lot of different Celestial cards as well. So it's definitely a very, very powerful card.
You're not even going to touch on my boy, The Great Beyond?
The Great Beyond, definitely one of the key finishes as well. But I find myself, not taking it quite as often as I used to. Perhaps because it's not being offered to me that often.
Right, some other flex slot options that we're not currently utilizing. Spell Thief is one that we've definitely used a great amount in the past, and you still sort of have access to. Burblefish is going to give you a Spell Thief some amount of the time when it's not busy pumping a handful of jettisons, which I always seem to get. Spell Thief, I just feel that recently playing it, and I think it's probably it depends on the meta that you're seeing and what you're playing against, how good Spell Thief is. And I've just found that particularly with all the Nasus sort of decks running around, that I'm just not getting enough value out of Spell Thief to justify wanting to have one in my deck. And I guess you're sort of in a similar spot at the moment.
Yeah, so at the moment, it's kind of like there are just so many good cards which could fit in this deck. So we've got a 40 card limit. Honestly, if we had a 45 card limit, I think Spell Thief would definitely be in the list. It's essentially just a really versatile piece. It's really hard for it to do nothing. And there are definitely spots where it can win you games, which would otherwise be unwinnable. So some of the best cards to pick with Spell Thief, if you do end up running it, your opponent's copy of Deny is a really good one. As well as a few other sort of game-ending threats. So one thing that Spell Thief does is that you can actually hit spells that are still on the stack. So a common play pattern with a Spell Thief, and this is good to know because you'll sometimes get it off Burblefish, is that your opponent will point a lethal atrocity at your face. In response, you can play Spell Thief, you can find your own atrocity, and then you can throw one of your units, either a big Celestial or a unit which has been pumped up by the Veiled Temple, at their face for lethal, or at their big unit to, save yourself.
Yeah, there are some really powerful lines you can do with Spell Thief, and it's such a versatile card. But yeah, like you said, I think it's just not quite there at the moment in this version. But there's definitely, I wouldn't fault you for wanting to put one in, and there'll be a lot of decks that you're playing against where it's just really powerful, and it's a very reasonable flex option to have. Another one that we feel less keen about, and it's one of your least favorite cards to have in this list, is Solari Priestess. What's your beef with Solari Priestess?
So I think Solari Priestess, it's a fine card. It does a lot of things that are good. It gives you access to this really strong portion of the Celestial pool, where you can hit cards like Fallen Comet to interact with your opponent's, Veiled Temples, their landmarks, their big units that are otherwise difficult to get rid of. It can also give you access to Written in the Stars to find your champions more easily. I think it does a lot of powerful things, but at the same time, one weakness of this deck is that you have a lot of tension when it comes to sequencing. So Aphelios makes certain demands of you when it comes to sequencing. So does Veiled Temple. So you end up in these positions where it can be really, really awkward to start with a Solari Priestess. And if you don't start with it, it's basically not a card. You're basically paying 3 mana for a 1/2, and you can really limit your options, really hurt yourself, or just put yourself in a position where if that card had been another one of these pieces, you would just be in a much better position. So for those reasons, and with this particular build, where, I think you've already got some really strong, expensive cards, you've got the elusives that you're beating down with, so you're less reliant on those Celestials, I don't really like the inclusion of Solari Priestess.
Yeah, I think it's one that it just looks so good on paper, and like you said, the pool of cards it pulls from is incredibly powerful, and yeah, it's just something about how the play patterns evolve in this deck is you've just never really got an opportunity to play it that feels good. It's always, you have to give up a lot to get it in, and at that stage, the question is really just, am I better off having different cards in this slot? And I think at this stage, we really are better off just running other cards.
Yeah, exactly right. I don't really like its inclusion here in TF Aphelios, but yeah, in a deck like Zoe Aphelios, I think it's a lot easier to slot it into your curve, and it's got more synergies, and I think it is very strong there, so I can understand why people have been running it in this deck, but I just don't think it's really worth it at the moment.
Were there any other flex slot cards that we haven't brought up yet that you've tried, you're thinking about bringing in, or you've got sort of on the cutting room floor?
Well, you mentioned the burble fish into jettison earlier, and I am thinking of just maybe we should get some more jettisons in here naturally. What are your thoughts on that, Maitland?
I just feel like I have easily enough access from the ones that I always get from my burble fish that I don't even need to think about bringing them in at all.
Okay, noted. If you have 3 every game, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I have seen some people running Astral Protection, and that was something we were also using, particularly when we were running Tarm in this deck for the seasonal. But I feel like I just like Bastion more at the moment. I think it gets you sort of a similar effect, but it's usable against a wider range of opposing card tricks.
Yeah, I agree. And at the same time, so many of your units just have low health to begin with that you really need them to be buffed up with a Sunblessed Vigor, be buffed with, Veiled Temple stacks already to make good use of that healing. So I just, most of the time, all it's really doing is giving your unit +4 toughness permanently, so double Sunblessed Vigor, at which point I'm a lot less interested in it.
Yeah, exactly. Like you're going to get the same effect out of Sunblessed Vigor as you will Astral Protection a very vast amount of the time, and situations where Astral Protection is better are probably situations where you're already winning the game, and it's not like the difference between Astral Protection and a card like Sunblessed Vigor probably isn't what you need to put you over compared to how many times it's considerably worse and less useful than Sunblessed Vigor. So that's where I am on Astral. All right, why don't we move on to discuss play patterns a bit? Why don't you get stuck into Aphelios, because you really sort of you're quite a big Aphelios fan. I think we obviously mentioned that you've got the foil, the prismatic version of it, and so why don't you start talking about some of your favorite play patterns when it comes to I don't have a nickname for Aphelios, Big Felly. To Big Felly.
Okay,
there we go.
Yeah, so Aphelios is just a super complicated card. I still remember the first time I read it, I had to read it 4 times, still had no idea what it did, and I can definitely say after playing with it for probably around 200 games now, I'm still learning things every time that I play Aphelios. So for those of you who aren't too familiar with Aphelios, I'll sort of run through the card. So Aphelios is a 3-mana 3/2 with Nightfall. So when you play it with Nightfall, you get to pick a moon weapon to create in hand. We'll go through all the moon weapons in a second. Each round, the first time you play 2 other cards, create the phased moon weapon in hand if you don't already have one. So let's talk through these moon weapons so that makes some sense. So basically, there are 5 moon weapons all up. When you Nightfall Aphelios, you get to choose which of these 5 you want. And basically, I want you to imagine these 5 moon weapons as if they were a circle. And each moon weapon is linked to the 2 moon weapons in front of it. So let's talk about them. So you have Calibrum, which is deal 3 damage to a follower. It's a slow spell, and it lets you phase into Severum or Gravitum. So next up, we've got Severum. These are all slow spells. So you get to give an ally +1/+2 and lifesteal this round. Phase into Gravitum or Infernum. So Gravitum, we have stun an enemy. If it's a follower, stun it again at the next round start. You can phase into Infernum or Crescendum. Next up, we have Infernum. Give an ally +2/+1 and overwhelm this round. And you can phase into Crescendum or Calibrum. Calibrum being that first card we talked about. And now we get to Crescendum, which is the last of the moon weapons and arguably the most powerful. This allows you to summon a 2-cost follower from your deck. If it has Nightfall, activate it, and then you can phase into Calibrum or Severum. So basically, you have these 5 weapons, and once you have played one, the next 2 spells you cast for the first time in a turn, Aphelios will give you whichever weapon you phased into. So the most common play pattern with Aphelios is starting with a Crescendum. So you would play your Aphelios, you would get your Crescendum, then you would play Crescendum and phase into a Calibrum. So at this point, Crescendum is the first spell you've cast that Aphelios has seen. So if you play one more spell, you get to generate a Calibrum. So a lot of the time you would phase into a Calibrum, and then you would phase into a Gravitum, and then you would phase into a Crescendum, then and sort of over and over until you run out of copies of Boxtopus. So that's sort of the basic beginning play pattern for Aphelios. Aphelios also levels up. So Aphelios levels up when you cast 4 moon weapons, and when leveled up, Aphelios becomes a 4/3 with quick attack, and still has the same ability of each round the first time you play 2 other cards, or round start, create the phased moon weapon in hand if you don't already have one, and moon weapons cost 1 less. So essentially at this point, Aphelios starts to make 2 moon weapons a turn if you end each turn without a moon weapon in hand. So that's sort of the basic rundown of Aphelios.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure even if you listen to this podcast and you've never played Runeterra, you've never seen Aphelios, it's pretty clear that there's a lot going on there. Aphelios is a pretty complicated card, and I think that having just the basis sort of understanding of how Aphelios works, even not understanding it all, just playing it and seeing what happens, it's quite easy to get a lot of value out of it. But to get the maximum amount and potential out of Aphelios is very difficult, and something you need to be really aware of and just practice a lot. And so I think it's really important and worthwhile to get a lot of reps with this card and think about how is it possible for me to get an extra moon weapon this turn, and making sure that you don't miss them. So something that is important to be aware of when you're playing Aphelios is that when you play your second spell for the turn, if you already have a moon weapon in hand, Aphelios won't create another one. And so you want to try and be prioritizing, if you have moon weapons in hand, that you're casting those as your first or second spells to make sure that you don't end up in a situation where you've often got a lot of things to do with your mana in this deck, and so you do a couple of things and then you play your moon weapon, and you've gone a turn where you're not making a moon weapon because Aphelios has already seen 2 spells cast. And so it's a really important play pattern to be aware of there. And also getting the Nightfall for Aphelios to get a moon weapon is really important as well. And sometimes you'll want to if like that situation we were just talking about, where you want to do a lot of things, you might want to do some of those things first, then play Aphelios, then use a moon weapon, then do something else and get that second moon weapon for the turn. And so just thinking about how you can sequence your turn to get the max moon weapons is really important in flipping Aphelios and just getting extra spells and extra value.
Yeah, exactly. And Aphelios just absolutely runs away with games. So really try to prioritize that. A heuristic that I have, which I think is quite helpful if you're new to playing with the card, is when in doubt, weapon out, and just do everything that you can to make as many moon weapons as you can each turn. And it's hard to go too wrong with that because you're just generating so much value. You really have to be careful and think about what you're doing, particularly with a flipped Aphelios and multiple temples out, because a lot of the time in those spots, one of your first 2 spells is going to be the moon weapon, And then you really have to think about, okay, how can I get the most mana out of Veiled Temple now? One other really common play pattern is I really like leading on the Moon Weapon. And the reason is, once that Moon Weapon is on the stack, so it doesn't even have to resolve yet, let's say you've played your Aphelios after your opponent has tapped out on their turn. So you Nightfall your Aphelios, you untap, you have the first action, you decide to play your Crescendum, and in response, your opponent plays a Mystic Shot on the Aphelios. You have no way to protect it, but in that spot, if you play any burst spell, so for instance, Guiding Touch on your own face, what's going to happen is Aphelios is going to trigger and it's going to phase into the next Moon Weapon. So you're going to be able to generate that additional Moon Weapon value, which honestly, it really adds up and can definitely win you games.
Yeah, and so something I definitely did early on playing with Aphelios was, Calibrum, for example, is a really strong spell, and my opponent might have a 1/1 and a 2/2 out, and I'm sort of waiting for a 3/3 to get that max value, but that's generally going to be incorrect to hold on to that for multiple turn cycles because, as Simon said, you've just missed out on a heap of spells, and so you're better off just firing off the Calibrum on your opponent's, on any follower that it can target, and then phasing into Gravitum and just continuing through the cycle as Aphelios lets you do. But so yeah, just weaponing out and just creating as many weapons as possible is really a good way to be approaching Aphelios. And also thinking about, it's easy to get into play patterns of getting Crescendum, getting Calibrum, getting Gravitum, back to Crescendum, which is a very powerful play pattern. If you do that every single time, you're only going to be so wrong and you're still going to do very well. But thinking about the times of where you really need to get Severum or where you need to deviate from that sequence to get a different Moon Weapon is going to really up your win rate. Particularly, Severum is the one that I find is the most important because there's a lot of matchups and decks where that's a really key card, getting that big hit of life in. And so, not just sort of autopiloting and really thinking about, you've got an anecdote you can tell about Graviton, but thinking about which spell you can get is really going to get you to that next level, and also surprise your opponent sometimes when they expect you to do just the standard Crescendum.
Yeah, definitely. So I think I will dive into that anecdote because it does kind of show sort of how these crazy lines can come up with this deck. So I was playing the Aphelios Twisted Fate Mirror. So I had the attack token on turn... Sorry, my opponent had the attack token on odds, and I had it on evens. So turn 1, I play a Duskbringer, they play nothing. Turn 2, we both play nothing. Turn 3, they pass to me, offering the end of the turn. So essentially, in this position, I felt pressured to play Aphelios, which was in my hand. So the risks are my opponent can have their own boxtopus, or they can have their own Duskbringer into Aphelios into Crescendum to kill my Aphelios, which would be, a huge blowout in that position. But I felt like I needed to commit to that line because the Veiled Temple is a really strong card in the matchup, and I didn't have it in my hand. My opponent easily could. So if I just give up this value, I can really sort of lose the game here. So what I ended up doing was I cast the Dusk Petal Dust, and then I played Aphelios, and instead of just taking Crescendum, as I would on turn 3 almost every other game, I instead took a Gravitum, which is a slow spell, stun an enemy. If it's a follower, stun it again at the next round start. So I took the Gravitum. My opponent played a Spell Thief, taking my Dusk Petal Dust. They played their own Aphelios, and then they summoned a Boxtopus, which I then got to play Gravitum on, and then I untapped, played 2 more spells to make my own Crescendum, got a Boxtopus, and killed their Aphelios. So if you diverge from those key play patterns in some spots, you can get some really big advantages, and you can sort of think outside the box about what level of risk you're willing to take on in those spots.
Yeah, and another one that I've seen come up in games, sort of from the other side and abusing it, is people auto-taking Calibrum, and then if you're playing a deck where you're not heavily focused on followers, so FCR, for example, you can quite easily strand that Calibrum in your opponent's hand with no targets, and so leave them where they're unable to continue on playing moon weapons if you just don't have any followers out. And they are able to, you can cast Calibrum on your own followers, so that there's ways out of that, but it can really cause a hiccup in your opponent's plan where they're trying to flip Aphelios as fast as possible. So that's another one just to be aware of, is that is Calibrum actually good against my opponent's deck, and am I going to end up just with a dead card in hand?
Yeah, for sure. And you're just going to get so rewarded thinking about the future as well. So yeah, thinking about, are they going to play another follower? Should I just go for a Severum here? Another common one that I see come up, which is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, is so you need to keep track of how many copies of Boxtopus are still in your deck, but you can still take Crescendum if you have no copies of Boxtopus left in your deck, and sometimes that's correct to do. So the reason you would want to do that is because it lets you cycle one moon weapon further, which can really be the difference between winning or losing, particularly if you decide you really, really need Severum on the following cycle and can't just get an Infernum in the meantime. So yeah, your opponents will emote you every time.
It's the worst.
Yeah, just they've got that locked in, but just keep that in mind. It can be correct to take Crescendum there, even when you've got no hits.
Yeah, and also just it is really important that you try and keep track of how many Boxtopus you still have left in your deck, because it's tough to get track of, but it makes the game a lot easier, and you can think through your plays a lot better if you don't have to constantly be scrolling through the game history to see how many Boxtopuses have trade off. And yeah, it's just really important for trying not to end up in that situation where you cast a Crescendum and your opponent BMs you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. A couple of other little tips to run into. So Severum and Infernum, because they give toughness, can be used to heal your allies which are already damaged. So if you have a Boxtopus which is damaged, you can't attack with it this turn, you still might want to find a Severum or an Infernum or use it on those units to sort of heal them up. You can also proactively do that to buff a unit out of avalanche range, for instance. So definitely keep that in mind as a viable play. I also want to talk about, this is the biggest mistake that I see from people playing this deck, and I see it even at a master's level. So when you're playing the deck, try to keep this in mind. So we keep talking about, on turn 3, you get to play Crescendum, you get to get a Boxtopus out. But that can sometimes be a huge misplay. So if there's no reason for the Boxtopus to be in play, you should almost always not cast the Crescendum on turn 3. So what would an instance like that look like? So a really common one is you're playing against an aggro deck. On turn 3, your opponent has the attack token. They play a Draven. You play your Dusk Petal into Aphelios, getting a Crescendum. They attack you with the Draven and whichever other units they're attacking with this turn. Now, in this spot, it would be a huge mistake to play your Crescendum because they've spent all their mana. You already know exactly what they're going to do. Having a Boxtopus in play right now doesn't really help you. But by waiting, ending the turn, untapping, and starting with a Crescendum, you allow yourself to get an extra moon weapon off of Aphelios on the following turn, and to potentially even play the moon weapon on that turn. So you give yourself a lot more options, because you can suddenly on turn 4, now you can play a Crescendum and a Twisted Fate, or a Crescendum and a Veiled Temple, and get access to an extra moon weapon, which literally just wouldn't exist if you just played the Crescendum a turn earlier. And you still end up in the exact same spot on board. So definitely keep that in mind, and don't just autopilot and play a weapon just because you can. Just really think about, how do I get this next moon weapon from Aphelios? And is the best way to do that, does that involve playing my moon weapon now or waiting?
Yeah, that's... I was hoping you'd tell that story again, because I needed the extra time of hearing it for it really to click with me and make sure that it's something that I'm not doing in games anymore, because I've definitely been doing that in the past. Just some other interesting points. One I see come up a lot with Severum is, and I don't really have any great advice here except for just think about it, but think about which unit you put Severum on. You quite often end up in situations where you have a number of different options. You'll have an Aphelios out, you might have a Burblefish out, you might have a Twisted Fate, you might have a huge Celestial unit, you might have a big unit that's been pumped with Veiled Temple. And instead of just defaulting to the biggest unit that you have, it's worth thinking about things like how much life do I actually need to gain here? How much do I get blown out if my opponent is able to stun or kill the unit that I put Severum on? And something I quite often do is put it on a lower value unit. So if I've got an Aphelios and a boxtopus, I might put it on the boxtopus. So if my opponent has a vengeance, they're forced to kill my boxtopus instead of my Aphelios. And so just make sure that you don't put all your eggs in one basket, I think is an important one with Severum, and something that I think about a lot in those situations where I'm casting it.
Yeah, for sure. Another really good thing to keep in mind with the Severum as well is that when you're playing against a burn or heavy aggro deck and you really need that life gain, one trick that they'll often use to deny your life gain is to glimpse beyond their own unit or Noxian further their own unit and hit your face so you don't get the lifelink.
God, I hate it when they do that.
It's so rude, yeah. But there are a couple of ways you can get around that. The first is, let's say they only have 3 mana left and they have 2 units in play. You have 2 copies of a boxtopus and 1 other unit. Always put it on the other unit, and then you can pull both of their units with boxtopus, and they'll have to use Noxian Fervor to either kill your lifelinker or deal 3 to your face. And the other way around that is that Severum and Infernum are friends. They work really well together. So you give one of your units lifelink, you phase into Infernum, you play another spell, then you play the Infernum. At this point, your creature has +3/+3, lifesteal, and overwhelm. So even if they kill their unit in response to your attack, you're still going to overwhelm through their dead unit and you're still going to gain the full amount of life. So really think about how can my opponent interact with this and what's my best way through it, because in some spots, all you really need are an extra 3-4 points of life, and the extra value that you're generating with your deck will just easily let you win.
Yeah, absolutely. The overwhelm with the Severum is such a really good combination. I've definitely had opponents who didn't realize that I'd had overwhelm, I think, and so they'd sacrifice their unit and ended up getting all that healing anyway. And the fact that Severum phases into Infernum is really important for that interaction. And I think the next sort of big level up you can get with Aphelios is instead of just plotting out your current turn or what you're going to do, thinking ahead to future turns, and things like getting Severum so that you can phase into Infernum next turn to get that lifelink and trample interaction is really good. And Infernum in general, I think, is an important one to think about, because Infernum, especially compared to all the other spells, does the least when you don't have the attack token. And so figuring out when you want Infernum, because it's so much better on your attack turn than your opponent attack turns, is really important, so you get that full value out of it when you do need it. And with Gravitum as well, planning out your next couple of turn cycles to think about, okay, do I need to Gravitum on this turn, or can I wait till next turn? And when do I really need to stun things down? Am I looking to open attack? Am I looking to set up for my Infernum next turn, or do I just want to get a Crescendum? Just thinking about what you're going to do with the next couple of moon weapons, and maybe taking a turn off to get on the right attack token with your Infernum, or setting things up with Gravitum is just a really nuanced and difficult part of Aphelios and playing Runeterra.
Yeah, definitely. And it's one of those things that, all these little tips, they might sound intimidating, but at the same time, if you don't have to do all of these, you'll still win heaps of games by playing Aphelios, even if you're not doing all these things perfectly. But if you just want to look for spots to level up, or even you might have seen a play and you might not have realized you were making a decision in-game where you actually are, and just thinking about that a little bit more you'll probably just win more games in that spot and just improve a little bit more. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of these are not necessarily things you should constantly be thinking about in game, but it's just important things to be aware of. And there's a lot of different areas. Runeterra is a very difficult game. There's a lot of different areas where you can be improving, and I think it's just really important to sort of be aware of different areas. And so you might be focusing on getting value out of Veil Temple, out of Twisted Fate, out of just using your mana effectively each turn. Keeping Hush for important threats. You might just be focusing on those sort of things, and just using Aphelios. And then as you get more comfortable with those things, you might start to think, okay, now let's sort of focus on getting the most out of the moon weapons, and let's focus on planning out turns. And it's just you focus on different things at different times in order to get better. And so understanding where those areas that are worth putting that effort in is just it's good to be aware of.
For sure. So there's just one extra point that I'd like to touch on Aphelios.
How could there be something else? We've talked so much about Aphelios.
Exactly. It's actually a really big one, which I think we may have missed, which is when Aphelios levels up, the moon weapon counter resets. Yeah. So the turn that you level up Aphelios, a common play pattern might be you might start with your moon weapon for some of the reasons we talked about earlier, but you actually want to play your moon weapon second, because then Aphelios will make a moon weapon, transform, and then you play that moon weapon and one other spell, and Aphelios will make you an extra moon weapon. So the turn Aphelios flips, you get additional value. So keep that in mind, because that is that could be a goal. When in doubt, weapon out.
Yeah, and that's definitely one that for me, I've parked in the, oh god, Aphelios is already so hard. I'm not at this, I haven't gotten to the stage yet. Plus, I'm just so excited to flip Aphelios whenever it's an option.
Oh, so good.
But I think that, the next sort of thing that I'll be focusing on is just thinking about when I get to that 3 out of 4 stage on Aphelios, okay, Simon always goes on about how you can get an extra weapon here. Let's think about let's sit down, let's get the calculator out, let's think about how I sequence my spells so that I can get that mythical extra moon weapon. Also a cheaper moon weapon. When they get to 1 mana, they really are. They're something, aren't they?
Oh, they're busted. They're so good.
The only problem is that you quite often don't have any boxtopus left, and so you have to do really awkward ones where you skip crescendo.
Oh yeah, no, just take crescendum every time. Send a message. Just definitely don't need Severum here, but I'm sending this message. Yeah.
All right, let's park Aphelios talk and go on to Twisted Fate. We've already talked a lot about Twisted Fate. What are some of the play patterns that you see come up that we haven't touched on as of yet?
Yep, so Twisted Fate, in this deck in particular, you're using blue card a little less often than you might in some other decks. Red card can be a really nice way for you to stabilize the board. For instance, what's the unit called, Maitland? The
Blighted Caretaker.
Yeah, if your opponent goes for a Blighted Caretaker to try to clear your Aphelios and another unit, it can be really, really good to Twisted Fate red card, clean up the board. There are also some aggro decks where that can be quite good. Gold card is a little bit better at the moment, because in a lot of games you might be spending your resources trying to kill a Lucian, for instance, and then at that point in the game, by turn 4, you can play a Twisted Fate and get rid of it. So I reckon you're still going to blue card probably about 50% of the time, maybe 60% of the time, but your red card and gold card ratios are going up compared to some other decks. Another really common play pattern is, just counting how easy it is to flip Twisted Fate. So a lot of the time, let's say you did blue card off Twisted Fate and you play pick a card. The next turn, you're going to be up to 5 cards. At that point, you're going to have to play either 3 copies of Guiding, a combination of Guiding Touch or Pale Cascade to flip Twisted Fate. So it's quite hard to flip Twisted Fate on the following turn, but it is possible. So on the following turn, a lot of the time, you'll want to use those pick a card options to protect Twisted Fate so that you can flip him on the following turn. So you want to be using your Sunburst Vigors, your Pale Cascades if you can, or perhaps even setting up an extra pick a card if the coast is clear.
Yeah, and I think especially compared to when we were playing a lot of Go Hard, like it was a bit of a meme for us that anytime you cast anything other than blue card, you were making a mistake. And you don't have really any 1 mana spells in this deck, and especially none as powerful as Gohart was, which let you sort of utilize that 1 spell mana really effectively. And also, just like you sort of said, red card and gold card just have a lot more value in this meta than in the last meta. And I think particularly with Blighted Caretaker is a really important one to be aware of. And there's quite a few turns where I won't play Twisted Fate for 2 reasons. One, because if they play Blighted Caretaker, it just absolutely destroys them when you play red card. And the second is, if I play Twisted Fate, then my opponent plays Blighted Caretaker, they get to eat my Twisted Fate.
Yeah.
And so the threat of activation of having 4 mana up, it can be really important against those Nasus decks that are looking to get a lot of slay triggers and to kill your Twisted Fate with their Blighted Caretakers.
Absolutely. Another really interesting play pattern, which has only come up maybe once or twice for me, but it was so cool that I have to talk about it here.
Has it seriously only come up once or twice? Because you talk about it like it's every game.
Sorry, I ment once or twice every game. Yeah, it comes up. Sorry, I misspoke. So you skip turn 1 and 2. Turn 3, you might just make some sort of a stalling play. You don't really have that much going on. You end up with 3 mana banked. Turn 4, you play the Veiled Temple. Turn 5, let's say hypothetically, your opponent, they played a Catalyst, they tap out for a Trundle. Well, what are you going to do? You have 3 spell mana, you have 5 regular mana for the turn. So in this spot, you can play pick a card on one of your cards in hand. Then you can play Twisted Fate into blue card. Temple is going to trigger. Twisted Fate is going to be a 3/3. You're going to get 2 mana back from the Veiled Temple. You're going to get 1 mana back from Twisted Fate's blue card. Now you're going to have the option to play another copy of Pick a Card, at which point your opponent will untap. You will draw 7 cards, 6 off Pick a Card, 1 for the turn, and Twisted Fate will auto flip. So that is a line which I've done a couple of times and is hilarious when it happens. So keep an eye out for it.
Yeah, and not necessarily that exact line, but looking for situations where you're able to flip to TF, as with all times you play Twisted Fate, is really important. And particularly with Veiled Temple now giving you access to more mana, is there's just more opportunities for you to try and weave in some of those cantrips to be able to flip Twisted Fate slightly earlier than your opponent might be expecting, and just get that game-ending threat a bit faster.
Yeah, and some decks just can't really kill Twisted Fate once you start getting temple stacks on it as well. So that can be a powerful option, but it doesn't tend to come up too often.
Yeah, it's just you've got a lot of 3 power units in this deck. You've got to go quite out of your way to get the temple stacks landing on a Twisted Fate. But if you're able to do it, it's really powerful because, like you said, the difference between 3 and 2 toughness is really large, particularly on champions at the moment. And then also once you get the first couple of stacks, then it'll just keep getting bigger and bigger. And so, yeah, Twisted Fate, especially with Quick Attack, is able to attack more often than some units safely. Although I'm still quite reserved with my Twisted Fates. And I definitely advise people to be quite reserved because, there's just so many spells and tricks. Every class has spells and tricks that can punish you for attacking your Twisted Fate. And so, and Aphelios, and so I have them sitting on the back line probably more often than is optimal, but the situations where they have something and ruin you are just too heartbreaking for me to risk.
Yeah, you definitely want to find that balance, but yeah, if you're not sure, leaving them on the bench isn't the worst decision.
All right. Let's move on. Let's talk about some of the matchups. So I'm going to talk about the bad matchups first because it's... I don't know how popular it is statistically, but I swear I've seen the Scargrounds decks with Braum and Vlad disproportionately whenever I queue up with this, and it's just so rough. The roughest thing I find is that it's very easy to flip Twisted Fate. Very easy to flip Twisted Fate against these decks. And you very quickly realize that is flipping Twisted Fate actually good, because red card when they've got Scargrounds out is really bad. And I think flipping Twisted Fate might be just an auto loss.
Yeah, it's definitely weird. It's a tough matchup. They just have so many ways to pressure you early as well. They just have the example, the card that always just completely destroys me in the matchup. Let's say it's turn 3, they've played a copy of Scargrounds, and then as the game keeps going, they end up developing a couple of threats. They might play a Braum or something like that, and then they eventually play the 5 mana unit, Tarkaz the Tribeless, which is the 5/8 on attack, deal 1 to all battling units. And every time I see that come down, like, normally when you're playing this deck, you're pretty happy when your opponent, plays a big follower that you can perma-stun with Gravitum. They put a lot of resources into it. It means your champions are surviving. But, I mean, when this guy's coming down on turn 5, they've already played some units you really have to lock down. The games can just really feel impossible sometimes.
Yeah, that's a really hard one to deal with. I mean, we could talk for a long time about why this matchup is bad, but it's really bad. If you're seeing a lot of this deck, don't play TF Aphelios. And if you are seeing just heaps of TF Aphelios, then yeah, get your Scargrounds, get them in your opener, and just ruin some people's days.
Definitely. Another matchup which I think is kind of even, but still a little bit unfavored, is TF Fizz. They're just such a fast deck, and previously when Aphelios had 3 toughness, it was basically an even matchup. But I think at this point, now that they can Mystic Shot Aphelios, it's really flipped the matchup quite a bit. In the past, a common play pattern that would sometimes happen is, you would play your Aphelios, it's a 3/3. They would have to play a copy of Get Excited, discarding a card on Aphelios. And at that point, if you had a copy of Pale Cascade or Sunblessed Vigor, you would get a really big advantage because your opponent has had to throw a card away, and that's a considerable amount of burn. But now that they only have to spend 2 mana for a Mystic Shot, I think that has actually hurt the matchup quite a bit, because it is so much harder for you to safely develop an early Aphelios.
Yeah, and one of the strengths of this deck really is that it doesn't have as many polarizing matchups as a lot of other decks. Most of your matchup spread is quite even, except, of course, for the 0% chance to ever beat a Vladimir deck. And so that's a sort of and that's sort of quite attractive to me. I really like decks that have sort of flatter spreads, and there's a lot more play in the matchups, and I don't just sort of feel like I'm going to auto win or auto lose based on what chance my opponents are running. Yeah, I think that's one of the good things about the deck that I like, at least.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's strong. Like, you don't really have matchups where you're, 70% to win, but at the same time, yeah, you don't really have those 30% matchups. And one of my favorite things about this deck is just how much versatility you get, how much flexibility you have. You just have so many options every turn, and you can really snowball that into an advantage if you can figure out what the matchup is about and what you should be trying to do.
Yeah, and one of the matchups that is quite good with this deck is the Nasus Callista, or just the Nasus Slay decks that are quite popular. This deck is a pretty good matchup against those, but apart from that, it's all pretty even, yeah.
Yeah. And in that matchup in particular, having access to cards like Hush is really strong.
Yeah.
You can sort of take over the board, get a really big incremental advantage. You can flip Twisted Fate some amount of the time if they can't Thresh it, or Black Spirit. But yeah, just being able to hold, Hush or Moonlit Affliction until they play an Atrocity just can give you a massive advantage, and you can just really outvalue them in the late game.
Yeah, similarly, Fiora Shen is a pretty good matchup as well. And again, just because you're basically on the strength of how strong Hush is against those archetypes, if you're able to leverage it well, which can be difficult against that deck because it has so many tricks. But yeah, if you can sort of lure them in, the dream is when you get to get multiple spells out of them and then Hush their unit, and that's just... It's such a huge... Which you're able to do sometimes if you're able to get a big unit with Temple out, you're able to get a couple of tricks and then hush them down. But it's just a really powerful card in that matchup.
And the thing that is really interesting in that matchup and the way you should be playing it is, you can sort of land an Aphelios and protect it in a lot of games. So the moon weapons can be a really powerful way for you to deal with their followers. So being able to play a Calibrum on a River Shaper, a lot of the time, it really sucks if in combat they buff their River Shaper, they draw an extra spell off it, and, their River Shaper's still alive. But if you play a Calibrum on it and they buff it with a spell, that's fine. That's not that bad for you. Later on in the game, if they, play a Cythria or a Screeching Dragon and you get to Gravitum it, that's huge. So your Aphelios cards are so good at dealing with their followers that if you then save your copies of, Hush and Moonlit Affliction to deal with their champions, then you're going to be in a really strong position. If you make sure to prioritize with your star shapings, taking big units over big spells, their denies end up really getting stranded, and they're sort of forced to deny your moon weapons, which is a really good exchange for you. Then you can really just take over these games against the deck.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some good tips there. I mean, it's honestly, hearing that just made me want to play Fiorashan, to be honest. But...
soon. Once this deck gets nerfed, we'll
yeah
slide back over.
All right, I think that's pretty much everything. We could keep going. It's just such a fun, interesting deck with a bunch of some of the strongest and most versatile cards in the meta at the moment. So, yeah, Twisted Fate Aphelios. Obviously, Simon's had extreme success with it at very high levels on the Master Ladder. Give it a go and try out some of the tips and tricks that we've given you, because it's just such a rewarding, interesting, and fun deck. I find that, all your games just play out so differently that it's just, always a unique experience.
Yeah, exactly. You just get to make a lot of decisions. All the games are really different. And honestly, if you like playing a controlling style of deck, it's really good. So the Veiled Temple, for instance, gives you a lot of options where, you get to play Temple. Your opponent wants to wait until you've gotten Temple value. You might play one big spell and then end the turn, or you might play two small spells, get your Temple value. You're back up to full mana. Your opponent is still in, a bit of a squeeze. They might pass back to you. You get to end the turn. So it just gives you so many options, so many ways to get small advantages. And, every choice you make really ends up mattering later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're the sort of things that, that's music to my ears. That's exactly what I'm looking for in Runeterra decks, in any card game, really, is decks that give me a lot of options and reward good gameplay, and then I'm going to keep learning the more I play. So yeah, just a fantastic deck. All right, thanks everyone for listening this week. Apologies again that the episode is a little bit late. Hopefully you've managed to work it into, well, obviously you have, because you're listening to this, so thanks for working it into your schedules, and we appreciate you listening as always. Feel free to join the Discord, which will be linked in the show notes and in our Twitter, and follow us on Twitter, and which is also linked in the show notes, all that sort of stuff. And feel free to reach out and let us know what you thought of this ep, what other decks you'd like to see us cover in deck guides, as well as just any other topics you'd like to see us cover in future episodes of the podcast.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, don't sleep on this deck. It's probably going to get nerfed pretty soon. Twisted Fate is definitely going to get tweaked, so try to get some games in, have a fun experience with it if you have the cards or have the wild cards to spare.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thanks, everyone, and we will talk to you again next week.
See ya.